There was a lot of things like that where you'd think, what the
From Stuff, a new 12-part documentary podcast.
He was into sex every day.
The Commune. Sex, drugs, and a guru called Bert. There are crimes, but this isn't a whodunit, it's a why-done-it.
Good God, adults agreed to this?
The Commune. Find it now on your favourite podcast platform or at stuff.co.nz/The Commune.
You've already been welcomed to Centre Point.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today we are revisiting a familiar group with a new perspective. Barbara has agreed to come and bravely share her story with us. But before we jump in, I wanted to say an extra special thank you so much to anyone who tuned into the 12-hour marathon live stream that I hosted last Saturday. We smashed our goal, but the fundraiser is still open, so please consider heading over and donating by following the link in the episode description. The 12-hour stream is available in its entirety on YouTube, and thank you so much to every guest, every contributor, and every person that donated. Also, before we get started, I wanted to direct you all to a podcast that launched earlier this year and is specifically focused on the subject of today's episode. It is called Worldwide, The Unchosen Church, which shares first-hand accounts of growing up inside of a doomsday apocalyptic cult. It is a series about the costs and rewards of a high-demand religious group and dispels many of the myths about what types of people join cults, and showcases the beauty, comedy, and tragedy of life inside Herbert W. Armstrong's Worldwide Church of God, hosted and created by a former WCG member, Trisha Jenkins. I will add a link in the episode description, so go and check it out. But for now, to share her experiences of growing up in this movement, here is Barbara. So hello, Barbara, and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. We are going to be exploring a subject that has already been covered on the show, but today we're going to be highlighting some other parts of the movement that are yet to be explored. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, thank you, Casey. It's a pleasure to meet you. And my name is Barbara, and we are talking about the Worldwide Church of God that I was involved with as a child and until I was about 18 years old.
And the Worldwide Church of God, from what I've come to understand from previous interviews with other guests, it's quite an expansive religious movement now, with a significant following around the US and further afield as well. So was it a specific area of America that you were involved with in the Worldwide Church of God?
Yes, my parents were members, meaning they had been baptized, both of them, in the early 1970s in a congregation in the American Midwest. And just to be clear, Herbert Armstrong, for most of the time I was involved, who was the founder of this church, and it was originally the Radio Church of God, founded in 1934. The name changed to Worldwide Church of God, I think in 1960s. At its heyday, I'll peg the time, let's say around 1980, I've seen statistics on it, either 70,000 or 100,000 global members. So it was a really vibrant, well-oiled money-making machine. And I just want to call out that, that some of the numbers in the press and in that time frame were annual income of this money-making machine was $70 million a year. And it had about, referenced in the press, again, New York Times, about $1 million a week were coming in when the church had been temporarily put under state receivership in California because of the irregularities with the finances. So I think it's really important to call out that this was a nonprofit organization masquerading as a religion, as something that was serving people, I would assume, if you would ask Mr. Armstrong what he was doing, he was an apostle of God and serving the people. But if you apply any degree of scrutiny, you rapidly see this was a very good money-making machine for him, his family, and those cronies in the church who were in power at the time. So my reference point is up till about 1990. And I know there were a bunch of splinter groups after Joseph Tkach died. And I know you've covered some of that in your other episodes and you've had other guests, but just so we're clear about the reference point today, approximately 1970 to 1990 is my reference point before I escaped.
Mm-hmm. And I really liked that you offered us a little bit of insight into sort of the financial giant that the Worldwide Church of God was at any given point or specific points in history, because I always think about these kind of corporate entities or like titans of industry that a lot of these religious groups end up becoming. And the Unification Church is always my go-to sort of example on how they're still the biggest sushi supplier of the US, and they have tons of shell companies, and the church has its kind of own separate organization, and it's worth billions. It's just worth so much money, and obviously all of that comes off of the backs of labor trafficking and people donating all of their earthly goods to the cause of the church. And so we can see it here again with Armstrong's movement, just kind of building on that empire, but then calling it a religion.
Yeah, it really was amazing, because at least, from my perspective in my congregation, the vast majority were blue collar workers. They were people who worked in, plants and were union members in a lot of cases, or they did their own small businesses. Maybe they were tradespeople, but they didn't earn a lot of money. By and large, we had very fervent, humble, naive people who earned very little, and they were donating large sums. So if you think of those numbers and you account for inflation, that's about $4,000 a member today they were giving their money. And of course, there were some that earned a bit more. There might have been some managers or people who were supervisors in local businesses, but I think I'd say the common denominator was very much lower middle class, or definitely lower income classes of people, and some that were literally living off the government food stamps and had serious financial issues, and vast majority were not rich. They didn't have that money to give in the first place, and they were starving their families, or really putting a lot of burden on the family members to give that kind of money.
And the part of the Midwestern area that you were in, was it classed as part of the Bible Belt?
No, a bit further north. So
Okay.
I would say, but very down the earth people, definitely God fearing. My parents were very God fearing. They met I think they dated for a number of years. That's something I'll come back to, but they got married. And then I think soon after they entered the church. They grew up Lutheran. So they were religious, but they wanted something more energizing in a religious experience. And I don't know, maybe they needed more activities in their lives on weekends, or just need to feel more urgency to why they're living life in general. But they decided to go all in with this church. And my sister, I had one sibling. She was a few years older. She was born into it like I was. She was taken off to church as a tiny, I don't know how old she was as a baby, but she was taken very young. And I was saved from that baby experience. I started attending when I was about 5 years old. I was babysat by my great aunt. Instead of being whisked away to church, I was cuddled and bonded with my great aunt in ways that I'll never forget. And she just treated me so much different to how I would have been treated during a church service, say, had I suffered through that with my sister and my family. So that's part of the story that I think I'll come back to. But yes, very God-fearing, simple people, not people who are looking for a lot of life except some meaning and purpose. So I'd say part of the country that was north of the Bible Belt, not directly in it. That's typically
Right.
meant for the South, more of the Southern US, or, sort of the Midwest that's further south.
And this particular area, was it sort of rich with various different religious groups and movements, in terms of if your parents were looking for something that was different to what they were already practicing, there would be a lot of variety in things for them to experience, or is it kind of, was it at the time very much focused on the religious movement that they fell into?
I think we need to contextualize again in the 60s, 70s through 90s. There was no internet. There wasn't this explosion of information we have today. And if you're looking in the market for a religion, you now have infinite options. I'd say back at the time, the Worldwide Church of God had radio broadcasts for years, which then also were supplemented by television. Televangelists were very popular in the 1980s. And Herbert Armstrong had a very slick way of advertising his movement through the World Tomorrow broadcast. And even before that, my parents had been listening to his radio broadcast and somehow really got interested in it through the free literature. And, if you wrote the organization, you would get some freebies. You could eventually ask for a minister that was in the local area to come visit you. But back then, besides seeing the Plain Truth magazine, which was also a free of charge magazine that the members dutifully put in local supermarkets, bus terminals, airports, it was a really big thing in the 70s and 80s. And the members helped distribute this free publication. So they found out about it. I don't think there were a ton of other options, to be honest with you. I think this was one of the main movements that was definitely national in scope. It was well advertised. Herbert Armstrong had an advertising background. I think he had a few businesses that failed before he went into religion as his new business, but he definitely got the word out, and that was part of the obligation to get that literature out by helping it be distributed locally to whatever places would agree to have it, because it was a religious booklet. So yeah, it was surprising to me that back then supermarkets would so readily put it in their, say their entranceway. If my dad brought 50 copies and put it on a stand and it was near where you got a buggy going into the supermarket, they were more than happy to have that there at the time. So again, there was no internet, there was no modern techniques of finding a religion like there was back then. It was very, very slick advertising that I think brought them in. And then they eventually met a minister and they did some counseling sessions. And then, unlike some religions, it's not as if anyone can attend Worldwide Church of God. When they got in, it was after several meetings with a minister to see if they were appropriate for membership and appropriate for attending, if they would gel with the organization, if they would fit in with the rest of the flock and not cause issues or question authority or question doctrines. So there's a vetting process, and it was a very, very strict surveillance of who would show up at these services. So once you were there, once you were in, you would probably be baptized not too long after that, or they wouldn't let you there. You couldn't be on the fence. You'd have to become a member, or it would be a very short try and buy, if you will, before somebody would decide it is for you or it isn't for you. But they didn't want non-converted people hanging around. That was just not going to work for this organization.
The lengthy vetting process is an interesting one, I think. I wonder if it puts, well, it probably has the same effect, I imagine. It probably puts some people off, but others it kind of maybe encourages like a rising to the challenge kind of mentality.
Well, you're being selected by God. The way it was framed is you are extremely privileged to have stumbled upon or heard a broadcast or somehow have heard directly through God's messengers on earth, the true word of God. And you should feel extremely privileged that out of all the millions of people who inhabit the earth, you have somehow been selected to know the truth, the very truth. And only these members of Herbert Armstrong's group knew the truth or could have access to the truth. And the truth was only accessible through the ministry. So there was a pruning, as you can imagine. It's very rare a human organization works flawlessly in a hierarchy where no one disagrees, that there aren't power struggles, that there aren't ways of shaking people out that don't fit in. And sure enough, that was a main fixation of the group, not only to nurture the relationships that are built through the various communication channels that the church had operating, the telecast and the radio broadcasts and the literature. But you had to be careful who you brought in, for what reasons they were coming in. But then the behavior was very closely monitored after you were in, so that you had that delicate hierarchy in place and that it wasn't going to be rattled. And I think at some point of the history that I experienced with the church, it was rattled, even though I was still very little. You can hear anger in the speakers' voices. So, to the services that happened, they were every Saturday. So there were 2-hour services. Sometimes they were in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. But 2-hour services, we were expected to show up much earlier than that. My parents were in the church choir, so that meant getting there about 2 or 3 hours earlier to have a bit of a practice. And then there were also Bible lessons for children. You had to complete workbooks and do some memorizing of scriptures. And that was then held after the church service. And then sometimes there would be a sports practice later in the evening for teams.
Gosh, okay.
It was a very long day and very high commitment on a Saturday. You really didn't have much time to think about anything other than the church. And then Sundays, if it was a teen we were talking about, there'd be sporting activities geared towards teens and youth group activities that would, again, take most of the day, because you would end up driving an hour or more to the event, and then you'd be there. You'd come back late in the day, and it really absorbed most of your time. So it was quite a commitment once you got into it. I can see why they were picky, seeing if you were committed.
Do you feel like it was encouraged for you to join in with more and more and more things, or were leadership kind of like happy as long as you just came to the main services on a Saturday? Or was there maybe like a competitive feel within the church that people are like, oh, well, I do the choir and I do all the extra things that are expected of us?
Well, there was certainly that. I mean, I think of movies like Office Space, where somebody wore the buttons of Flair. The more that you wore in the restaurant, the job, the better, more points you got, the bonus or brownie points. Yes, more was definitely better if you offered to serve more, if you did more activities rather than fewer, if you played a musical instrument like I did, you got extra points for that, even special brownie points if you played in church with special music or a choir. Yes, there was all kinds of ways to get brownie points. But before we look too closely at that, I would say it prohibited somebody from doing normal things. So the whole focus of the church was to have people financially and in all other ways, their resources were to be invested in the church, their time, their effort, their energy, their hope. Everything was about the church, and you were dissuaded from having contact with anyone else outside of it, including your own relatives, who, if they were unconverted, were really manipulated by Satan and a very bad influence. So, if you look at the options you had, other than do more church activity, if you had the energy for them or the will to do them, you had very few options other than the church. Mm-hmm. You weren't allowed. So it was Sabbath keeping, right? So from Friday at sunset to Saturday at sunset, children were not allowed to participate in any school activities. And that's when most sports or socials or other enjoyable things that schools would offer for children often happened. It was very rare it was a Sunday or a school night. So that basically it removed any possibility that you could integrate well with the local community. When you really pieced all this together, it was a deliberate effort. And also with the holy days and the restrictions on birthday celebration and everything else that was removed, completely erased from you, that was there in other people's normal lives. Your options were very limited. What else are you going to do with your time other than spend more time with the church, more time with these people that you already have a lot of time with.
And the sort of messianic influences that come through in some of the practices of the Worldwide Church of God, like keeping the Sabbath on Saturdays, is there any credence given to Sunday like there might be in some other mainstream branches of Christianity?
That was deemed, and I am not a theologian, I'm not a church researcher, and I don't, for today's purposes, I'd prefer to just focus on the experience itself. But Sunday was the wrong day to worship. That was made very clear, that was other Christian churches. They're wrong. You know, that they're worshiping on the wrong day, basically. And there were various reasons given why Saturday was the correct day. And I think Herbert Armstrong had broken away from Seventh-day Adventism and started his own church. So there were roots in some of his beliefs around the keeping of the Sabbath, but that was a major tenet. You should not participate in any way, shape, or form in any religious ceremonies happening on Sundays. Goes without saying, you shouldn't be going to other churches or doing anything with other churches or participating in social activities that had other affiliations with churches. You were supposed to be doing only the work of God through the Worldwide Church of God.
Right. And I suppose in that sense, it kind of goes with exactly what you were saying before, in terms of if you were to try and interact with other people outside of the church who were maybe affiliated with other churches, which you shouldn't really be doing, but say you kind of speak to your neighbor and they're part of a different church. If you're practicing on a Saturday and they're practicing on a Sunday, on your free day, Sunday, when you're not doing anything holy, there's nobody else around to speak to because they're all at their church services on a Sunday, which, according to Armstrong, is the wrong day to practice. So again, kind of making it difficult to have those connections with people that you might pass by day to day.
Absolutely. And it was a very black and white type of thing. You're either in or you're out. It's either you're influenced by Satan and hopelessly manipulated by Satan, or you're converted or in the process of being converted as a child. You're having the right influences, but it was very black and white. You're either in or out, and all the people who are out are influenced by Satan, and you should therefore stay away from them as much as you could, because the devil has them in his control. So very clear instructions there. It's not leaving any room for conjecture or gray area, or it's, all cut and dry. And I think some people really, and my parents included, I think they really needed that level of clarity and that kind of simple instruction and that type of authority in their lives. I think, those decades that we're talking about, there was a lot of social upheaval and a lot of social change in the US. And I think a lot of the more conservative types in the US were looking for something that anchored them more in the past. So reflecting on it over the years and even having some discussions with my parents, I asked them at some point, how or why did you get into this thing? And I think my mother's excuse was, well, we needed something to do with our time, and your father really believed these things. And I thought it would be something good for the family to do with its time on the weekend. It would have been boring without this church. We got to know so many people, and, it became, sort of like our own family, although I use that term loosely because there are a lot of people that you really didn't want to interact with that were in that congregation. They were selective who they befriended. But it was something to do, and it was something to do with your time, because they had so many ways of organizing your time for you that really there was no time left and no money left after they were done. So it made life much more simple.
It's not hard to see either why, if your parents were potentially looking for something different or had already been influenced by Armstrong's movement throughout the various strategies and propaganda that Armstrong was really tapping into during the sort of Jesus movement period of America in the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s, with the Children of God, the 12 Tribes, the Unification Church, all of these groups became so prominent, and they all offered something that was different from one another. But in the area that your parents are in, as you were saying, they're influenced by radio, they're influenced by magazines, they're influenced by free things that they can sign up for and get sent to the house. They're influenced by televangelists and actually just sitting in the living room watching these sermons on the TV. It's not surprising that it was this particular movement that they found themselves involved in. And then you're born into this movement. And I'm wondering how your early experiences with the church were so different from your sisters. Was there a reason why your parents decided to leave you home for those early years with your aunt, or was it just the way things worked out?
I still to this day don't know. I could ask my mother, I suppose, if I wanted to revisit this dark era, but from what I understand, she really loved my sister and me dearly, and loved to have time with us. And I think it was just a practical consideration. Having two small children and taking them into this congregation was very distracting, not only to them in the services, listening for 2 hours or trying to keep your children quiet or preoccupied with some toy or whatever, but the others, if there were an outburst of tears or just disturbance of having to go to the ladies' room and take care of the baby, it was a convenience to let me stay, and also politically, quelled the why don't I see your children as often as I'd like? It was a very easy fix for that. And then I think they supposedly left it up to me as a 5-year-old if I wanted to join my older sister and parents going to church like a big girl, or stay with her. My great aunt. And of course, I chose to go with my family at that point. I think that's probably healthy and normal to want to be with the rest of your family. But I have to say, I had the run of her house. I could run around and draw, and, big chalkboards. I remember just being really creative and having a blast running around. And she would have lots of candy, put it on a table and set it out, and I could eat as much candy as I wanted to. And she would read me Christmas cards. She had this box of things. Like, she had this box of things, including Christmas cards, where I think she had this agenda where, and she was like the other relatives I had, probably really thought my parents were into something really stupid. And I'm sure there were some remarks time to time about that religion isn't really something you should be involved with, but no one successfully influenced my parents in that way. But she was reading me Christmas cards, and I don't know if she was doing that deliberately to sort of immerse me in experiences that she thought I wouldn't get otherwise. But she would try to spend as much time with me directly and read to me and just let me play and be happy. And one of the reasons I agreed to do this discussion with you today is I recently moved fairly long distance and had to clean my whole house of documents and photos. And one thing I noticed was in the pictures of me as I aged from, say, age 4 or 5 to older, my facial expressions really changed for the negative. I looked like a happy child in the pictures until I was about 5. I think something deeply sad happened to me as soon as I started absorbing these church messages and being more involved with the church people. So, when you see these things and you relive your life through pictures, if you've ever done a big cleansing of your house and big cleanup and scanning of all your old photos, sometimes it rattles you to the core what you see that you might have even forgotten about. And that rattled me recently. Just the striking effect it had on me during school years, and just how it just messes with your mind. And that's really what I wanted to convey today, that the damage it does to children who had no choice but to go with their parents to church and be drugged through this whole experience without any say over it. That when you're doing that to children, it really leaves indelible marks. It's really something that's ignored. I don't think government or leadership of any type looks at this as an abuse. I call it mental rape, or I don't know what the psychological term for it is. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I do think there's such a thing as mental abuse and mental rape psychological rape. And if I can categorize the Worldwide Church of God, it was doing a lot of this type of rape to very young children and infants, brainwashing, the installation of fear from the youngest age that things could happen and would happen. Terrible things are going to happen to your family, to your parents, to you, to society. And then just on a practical level, you know, if you made an outburst in church, you'd be taken to the bathroom and spanked. You'd have the living daylights spanked out of you. They would talk about removing the will of the child, that you had to hit hard enough to take the will of the child out. So it's really chilling. It's, you know, it goes beyond taking money from adults. Taking money from adults is one thing. It's also extremely hard for me to understand how someone can call himself an apostle of God, and these henchmen, these ministers running the organization at the tactical operational level can sleep at night doing the things they were doing to people. But when you are messing with children in this way, it's a different level of manipulation and abuse. And if you've not gone through it yourself, it's very hard to relate to it.
With your relationship with your great aunt in those early years and her kind of, you know, really enriching your life in the way that you explained, and then your decision to join your family in the church, I feel like if I gave the option to one of my kids, like, hey, do you want to stay here or do you want to come with mum and dad? Like, of course, want to come with mum and dad. But even if you did decide to stay with your great aunt and carry on having that time with her, and you were given that option on whether to attend services or not, how many children involved in this didn't get that opportunity, didn't get that chance?
Very few. I shared this with few of my close friends and they were terribly jealous. They said, no wonder you were able to turn out normal, or at least looking normal, because you weren't brainwashed from birth completely, you know. And I didn't realize that at first, but but it doesn't mean then you're not even more conflicted.
Even if you did continue having that time with your great aunt, your life would have still been impacted by this greatly, because your siblings were being impacted by it, your parents were being impacted by it, and there's no way you can keep all of these high demands and all of this time and money being given to this cause out of the family home. Of course, it's going to impact absolutely everything you do, even if you're not attending those services. And I feel it's really important to kind of highlight the severity of how your life would have been impacted by this, with or without that escape that your aunt provided you with in those early years. You mentioned that you had an older sister. Were there more siblings? I don't know if you want to give us an exact number or just talk about whether there were more of you, or did it just stay as the two?
It was just an older sister. I like to imitate everything she did and be with her all the time. And that's probably why I wanted to end up going to church with my family, because I would be with her and be acting like a big girl and, you know, be able to sit on the chair during services and not have to take a nap, or at least most of the time not, but wanted to be like the rest of my family. I think that's normal. So, and I don't think there really was a choice. I think they were doing that so my great aunt knew that it was coming from me, or at least heard it was coming from me, and it wasn't they were tearing me away from her, which would have been traumatic for her. So she looked at it as something I wanted, and that's what she let me do without any contesting of that.
And you kind of mentioned a little bit about what life for children in the Worldwide Church of God looks like. There's themes that come through repeatedly across multiple congregations of this religious movement that talks about systemic abuse of children, physically, spiritually, emotionally. What is the day-to-day like for children involved? Are there separate play groups in your congregation where the children are taken aside, or is everybody expected to take part in the services as equals?
So I'm going to frame it up as a commercial enterprise, because if I'm the cult leader, I'm looking at the financial health of the organization. What you need to do is you need to grab them young, and you need to put the fear of God in them, fear of being outside of this one true religion, the fear of, betraying your parents or disappointing your parents. You just need to be completely in it 100%. And then to get people to stay, because rather joyless and unpleasant in so many ways, other than the socialization you have in the church, they had to put on some, youth activities, children's activities, and teenage types of activities. So there was a good investment in those types of activities, that people were kept busy, and that you were expected to make your friends in the congregation, and your families were supposed to support that and do whatever they could to make sure you were well integrated into the youth group, well integrated into these activities, and that you weren't a loner, or that there wasn't a risk that you got distracted by your school friends, or you had any chance of participating in those school activities and getting drawn away. So if you aren't exposed to normal things, and your set of activities is pretty limited, you will bond with the people that you're with. And there's really not much you can do about that. There's not even other options you have to avail yourself at. And before the internet, and before the type of information we have nowadays, there's no way of accessing alternatives, or even considering alternatives to how you were positioned to grow up. So yes, there were camps, there were teenage activities every Sabbath, as I mentioned, that would start early in the morning and go well beyond the church service. There would be potluck meals, and sometimes before we got a really strict minister, there was one that allowed square dancing, or maybe a 50s music themed social, something more fun. But then we got another minister in the early 80s that really clamped down on a lot of the more liberal things that had been exposed, let's say, to the headquarters. So they shuffle the ministers around every 7 or 8 years for that purpose, to make sure that no congregation is being managed too loosely, and that, again, this hierarchy is kept, keeping everything in check, and no minister has too much power in any one area. So they rotated them. And now looking at that, that's good management, good management of this entity, so that you don't lose members, you have consistent messaging, you have the right number of activities, and you stay conservative in your approach, and it's orderly.
In your school years, were you surrounded by other children that were within the Worldwide Church of God, or were you somewhat of an anomaly amongst your peer group?
I was definitely an anomaly, and I would say the things that stuck out the most were being removed from school activities that had holiday themes. So I know you had another guest that described this, but Jehovah's Witnesses, and primarily that group, but I think to some extent Jewish children, but not in my school, there weren't any, would probably be taken out of some of the Christian holiday activities and put in the library. Basically, anyone that had parents who didn't want you to participate, whether it was a Halloween parade or Christmas party, or even an art class that was dealing with creating cards or crafts dealing with holidays, I would go to the library. I would be removed. The teacher would gently, tell me I needed to go just hang out in the library for a while, just sit there and read. And then the other thing that was noticeable was every fall with the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a mandatory event. It was a holy day series of a few holy days, but a whole bunch of days in the middle. So about 8 days in total. Where you had 2 high holy days, and you had days in the middle where you were there also going to church services. So you had at least one church service a day. But this was, you would take the family and either go to a site that you could drive to, or in my family's case, we liked warmer weather. So my parents would either drive or fly to Florida or Virginia or warmer climates for this convention and spend 10% of their income. So the tithing was supposed to be, first 10% was to the church, send it in directly off your gross income, it was supposed to be. And then the second tithe was to save for this Feast of Tabernacles, where all that money was supposed to be spent on this alone. And if there was any excess tithe left over, that was collected at the end of the feast, and you were supposed to return it to the church because that wasn't yours. It was God's. So it was, for my family, which was, I'd say, lower middle class. My parents married late, and they fortunately had purchased their house. They didn't have mortgage payments, so that gave us a little bit more breathing room. But let's just, for argument's sake, say that my father in his high earning years was making $50K a year. $5K would go to this Feast of Tabernacles. And we had to spend it there. So we went out to eat a lot. We stayed in hotels. We had nice pools at our hotels. We had our nice little feast, and then that was it for the whole year. Like everything else was sad and, kind of sparse. And we were cheap with, purchasing clothing, and we didn't take any other vacations. There was only that religious trip every fall, but it was very noticeable when they'd take me out of school. As you can imagine, came in late September, early October. That was soon after the school year would start. And I would have to be the one to ask my teachers. My parents would have to get permission from principal or whatever else written wise, but I would have to approach my own teachers and tell them, my parents are taking me to this religious thing for X number of days, and I need assignments in advance so I can work on them while I'm there. Can you please give me some work? And you can imagine the reactions from the teachers. Of course, I'm sure they knew it wasn't my fault. So, but just in terms of the optics of that with the other kids. Yeah. And when they would ask me where I'm going and I would describe what we were doing, I was clearly the strange girl in the class who did this every year. Now, this wasn't just a one-time thing. It happens every year around the same time. So you just get into your new grade, you meet the people and your teachers, and you're getting accustomed to the classes you have, and then they yank you out for 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how it fell and how many days your parents would take you out. But it was a minimum of 8 days total. Mm-hmm. And I remember being out as much as 2 full weeks of school every given year for this. And I had to do the work on my own. Now, of course, up through a certain grade level, that's probably easier to do than in your high school years. But in the high school years, it became very difficult. And certainly kids who did this, and there was one other kid in my school who, to a certain grade, was in the same religion that went out during the feast as well. We were not taken seriously academically by the high school teachers. So it definitely made me stand out. I would say I had a couple good friends in school, but it was never anything outside of the school day. It was pals that I sat with at lunch. It was people that knew, what I did with most of my time and who my parents were, and maybe their parents were evangelicals or they were also pretty religious. And I think the parents liked the fact that mine had some religion or focus on that. So it worked. I had a few good friends in school, but again, they weren't part of my life outside of the school day.
And I suppose you get back from those kind of 8 day to 2 weeks away from school, and then you're straight to Halloween, and then not long after that it's all of the Christmas celebrations or Thanksgiving as well. Is that something that, because I suppose that's November, so you're kind of like every month there is something.
The church didn't really have too much to say about it, but they did say it's a government or non-biblical celebration. They didn't prohibit it, but it wasn't really something that would financially put a damper in the church's fundraising, let's say. And what I've figured out, at least I think when I'm looking at this from a financial perspective, the church prohibited anything that could conflict or compete with the funds going into the church. So if you look at Cigarettes were absolutely taboo. They would not bring in somebody who smoked. There's a lot of money that's spent on cigarettes, so that makes total sense. The other thing that they discouraged was anyone saving for college or thinking of sending their kids to college other than Ambassador College, which was the church college. So that again, if you have a choice of tithing or not tithing, retirement savings or education, you name the normal types of investments, they had to be minimized. And how you minimize the value of saving for both of those things was, first of all, the world is ending soon. The date changed a number of times when the world was supposed to end. But if the world is ending, then you certainly don't need retirement money, right? You don't need dental expense money. You don't need to save to fix your teeth or to save, for your health care when you're older. If everything is going to hell in a handbasket, pretty much, and there's going to be a great tribulation in the next 10 years or 5 years or 15 years or whatever. But same with school. If school is of no value and education is no value because A, you're not going to need it. B, it's deviant and decadent, and studying anything is going to lead you astray and take you out of the church. So I see all this as just a great scheme, a very well thought out scheme of random prohibitions that all led to the same place. It's diverting the resources to the church.
Barbara, this is I'm having like some kind of like epiphany, like absolutely everything you've just said. I suppose that going from Steve Hassan's bite model, I'm thinking, restricting things like alcohol and tobacco. It's a form of control over, what substances people can have, even just coffee, because coffee is expensive as well. Even just, I thought it was just controlling people's diets and substances that they intake as a form of control. But I never considered it from a financial standpoint. And there's so many religious movements that will say you don't need further education because your life should be dedicated to the church. You don't, what do you need further education for when you're living for God? So, you go and work for your auntie's cleaning business so that you can give as much time to pioneering as possible. Stay close to your community so that you can parent full-time all of these children that you're expected to have, or whichever way it's positioned to you from whichever high demand religious group to the next. And then Halloween, the price of costumes, the price of candy. I just assumed that Halloween was off the table because of the pagan beliefs and the devil worshipping and witches and the symbols.
That's a good cover story. That's a good cover story for a lot of this, but it's diverting resources to a different place, and that place was a very corrupt individual with an absolute hollow moral core. That's indescribable. I just don't know how many lives, how many children, what the cost that's hard to quantify is of all this. But I just feel like this organization got off scot-free on some level. And I have found over the years, there are some websites that people have put up exposing, anything from opinions and stories. You don't, like, I always think these are good sites for the health that comes out of being able to express what you experienced. No one can take that from you, what you experienced. Now, whether it's something someone is going to lash out or disagree with, or, poke holes in it, all I can say is all the experiences were very different because the ministers were different. As I mentioned, they switched them around every 7 or 8 years to make sure it was a more consistent way of operating. But there were variations with the ministers. I read things online that talked about a lot of sexual behavior that inappropriate sexual behavior that I personally didn't witness in the congregation I grew up in. I didn't hear so much that going on with the ministers, but there are other stories, even in the Armstrong family, about that happening. I have no idea if that happened or not. I can only say that even absent some of the more egregious stories and lapses of ethical behavior or judgment, the impact on children, I think, was universal. that you see in the stories. And I read about suicides in a number of church areas. I see, some people probably came into the church with their own boatload of issues. It wasn't as if the church caused the issues, but it certainly could put someone in a much worse place coming in if they're that vulnerable and that weak and looking for answers. And the answer is basically surrender your whole life, including your finances, over to the church.
I'd just absolutely never considered it. I mean, I'm atheist and Christmas is so expensive, buying gifts for people, and we still put a tree up and decorate and stuff, but there's all of that to consider, and the symbolism of Christmas, with the trees and everything. But of course, I mean, maybe not so much now, but growing up in the 80s and 90s, parents, make costumes for their kids to go and be in Christmas plays in school, or organize Christmas fairs, and all of that time and energy that you would be putting into your kids' contributions to Christmas activities or Halloween activities or summer fairs for the school or whatever it looks like in your community is time that the church probably thinks should be given to them, and that energy spent on church-related activities instead. Wow, my mind is just like reeling right now.
It's the money focus, but also they would have been more fun. Those events tend to be more fun, the ones that have joy in them, or there's some fun attraction of costumes and being yourself or developing your own persona or character in these costumes. Heaven forbid you would do that in the church, right? It's very prescriptive what you should become and what you should think and how you should behave. So all that was definitely polar opposite of what was encouraged in the church. You were not allowed to have your own opinions. There was only one truth, only one way of looking at things, and that would be enforced. I can give you examples of that, but say you wanted to put a little makeup on, or maybe lighten your hair if you had naturally lighter hair, but you wanted it looking more blonde. There was no room for any of these types of personal choices or decisions on what to wear that was outside the norm.
Again, could be just an expense thing, because makeup and hair.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Wow, I need to rethink everything now.
Yeah. So my parents, for instance, never put a lot of value on buying clothing or expensive clothing. It was a very modest amount of money we put on that. I'd say even to this day, I don't value certain things, but just like Christmas expenditures, I'm an atheist, and I don't mind that I can save that money even today. So I can't say all this was bad. It was just the problem of being redirected to an individual profiting at the top of this organization. Yep. It wasn't that some of the values were skewed. I think they were skewed in a somewhat constructive way at times, but it's a question of who was getting the money. Was it being repurposed for your education? Were you being sent to tutoring, to get good grades in math or something like that? Or was it being siphoned off?
Yeah.
And in this case, it was being redirected to a different place out of fear. So,
and when people claim that the money is for God, there is not an entity at the end of the month standing there waiting for their money that's being collected for them, and then handed over to God. That's, so when people say the money's for God, it's really like for somebody that's an atheist, I think probably difficult to be like, well, where's the God? Why is God not coming to take his money? So, or their money.
That was a funny thing too about Herbert Armstrong. So there was all kinds of footage that the church, and they had very fancy media for the time, their audio visual equipment and their telebroadcast was very cutting edge. And that's what gave it credibility. People would see this and they'd say, wow, the technology just looks superb for its time. But we would see footage of Herbert Armstrong wearing really expensive clothing and Steuben crystals that he was gifting to world leaders to get photo ops. And all this was captured in 60 Minutes and other exposés. And this corresponded to the time where also the church went into receivership. mostly because of the optics of the expenditures, and given the revenue that they knew was coming in, but where it was going and how it was being liquidated. The properties of millions of dollars were being sold, and it was very questionable what was happening. There were jets that, the Armstrongs were flying around in, and the top leadership were flying around in. So just the optics of it, if we were leading simple lives and in our humble little lives in the congregations, and you had these images that flew in the face of everything that was proclaimed at the local level. Even as a child, I was sort of wondering who this angry guy Armstrong was. I mean, he would get angry in his sermons. He would pound sometimes on the lectern. His face would get red, and he just looked like a bellicose old man. And kids can see through this type of thing. I mean, I'm sure you have your own kids, but they sort of know if somebody likes kids or not. Same with pets. You get a vibe, right? Is this a good or a bad person? Is there something wrong with this person or not? And I always had the feeling he was an angry, greedy man whenever there'd be a broadcast of Herbert Armstrong speaking or something. Like I would always feel very uncomfortable and terrified, because he was supposedly this powerful leader that was next to God. So I believe that with all my being up until a certain age. There was no doubt in my mind. I had to trust my parents. I believed my parents. They seemed like they were trying to steer me the right way. And I believe that was the real church up until a certain point. But he always bothered me, the optics of that. Like, why is he in that plane? And why is there this expensive auditorium where he has the college people at? If you ever saw the footage of Pasadena, there were just some contradictions. And I would ask my parents things like, well, who created God if God created all the people and the creation and everything? And my dad would say, well, that's just a big secret. We don't know who created God. I was like, so I had a lot of unanswered questions from a pretty young age. But I ascribe that to having been sheltered from the church for the first several years. I do. I think there was a healthy curiosity that survived the brainwashing.
I feel like most of my own exposure to televangelists is like big red sweaty faces convulsing, like veins and almost purple in the face, very fierce, very almost angry, as you said. And as a child, if you don't understand the rhetoric and language that's being used, you might just be reading the body language like, and of course there are terms that are applied to those moments of hysteria or fever that we often hear about on the show. But that's most of my exposure to televangelists as well, is that type of sermon. So I'm sure there's some nice, calm, peaceful ones that you can go and watch, but yeah, I don't know. It's not like you can switch on the telly at any moment over here in the UK and see like a whole string of different pastors and preachers giving various sermons. And you mentioned that there is limited to no individuality sort of within the Worldwide Church of God that's encouraged. And like you wouldn't want kids to dress up in costumes and feel kind of connected to a character that they're fictionalizing or just role playing with. Is that the same with things like music? Because you mentioned that your parents were part of the choir. You mentioned that you played an instrument. Were you able to choose your instrument? And at what age did you start to play?
I think my parents did. Well, my father had been in a country and western band in the 50s and 60s. So that's kind of an adorable little side story. He had a Volkswagen microbus. Have a picture of that I found recently.
Wow.
And so they did have lives before the church, and I always wonder what would possess someone going in a different direction. But as to music, there was very much prescription around the music. So There's clearly satanic music, good music, and bad music. Again, the black and white kind of thing. And there were lists created. Our strict pastor put out a list for the two congregations that he ministered to, and it had a list of all the popular music that was good, bad, or mixed in categorization. And there were actually cassette burnings where parents were supposed to, if they found anything in their children's rooms or, confiscate anything, and collectively we get rid of the bad influence, records, cassette tapes, whatever it might be. But he was very strict about that. He said God likes certain types of music, think along the lines of choir music and the church hymnal, which, I guess a relative of Herbert Armstrong had put together and composed, and some of them were not very easy compositions to either play or to sing, but nonetheless, they were in a purple hymnal that we all had. So those were okay, properly screened. Classical music was just fine. My parents turned me on to lessons because they saw I had a real aptitude. I don't know how and when. I just know they saw sheet music in this one store of musical instruments, and the one day they were scouting around, and I guess someone sold them some violin lessons, that I was going to take those lessons. And I ended up taking those lessons for about 7 years and became very good. And the teacher was a very young teacher working on her PhD, which is a good way to bring up her, because just like my great aunt had an influence, this teacher was a feminist, an activist, working on her PhD, and she met my parents. And the only common denominator was, this is a gifted little girl. Why don't you teach her how to play? But what they didn't realize is that with the music instruction, there was this essence of who she was coming through,
Right.
This very strong woman. And I don't want to say she would give me any lectures on anything or talk about religion. Quite the opposite. She kept away from the sensitive areas, but she knew influence over me in ways that my parents never grasped.
I love that. That's amazing.
So she, and I'm still in touch with her to this day.
Wow, that's amazing.
There were a good number of decades where we didn't talk, but in recent years, I've reconnected with her, and I expressed my appreciation for the influence that she had on me at the right time.
Oh gosh, I love that so much.
She was this role model who lived alone. She was getting her PhD come hell or high water. She was living in a pretty conservative town. She was really prioritizing music and doing what she loved to do over everything else, putting all her resources towards that. And the love of her life was music. And my parents sometimes would make comments about this very independent woman. I wonder if she's gay, or, wonder what the deal is. She lives alone. Did you notice what she's doing in her house when you go in there? Like they asked me, did you ever see pictures of her family or of a boyfriend or something like that? They were just dying to know a bit more, but not really. I think they knew she was very different, but she was having good luck with teaching me music.
Wow.
And at some point it abruptly stopped. And I can tell you that story might be a good time because you had asked me to address how I fell out of this or decided to come out and leave it. And one of the big reasons was it was becoming too much. So with the music lessons, I was expected to play in church in various capacities. The brethren, the members, and all the kids, they knew of me, not really as a person, but this woman, this girl who had these musical abilities and was applying them in such a godly way, and they didn't really see me as a person or an individual. They saw me as the player of this instrument, and that was my way of serving God in the church. And what happened was in my high school years, I was in advanced placement courses for the first year or so. And then because of the church and the influences and the demands on my time, and just that my parents didn't know, like they would have never been able to have a tutor help me, or even with the SATs or anything like that. So my focus was more on the church than it was on my academics. And this came to a breaking point. one day I started having a tingling sensation throughout my left side of the body in school, and it was becoming more distracting. Like it was almost creating a white noise in my left ear. So they took me to the ER, and I stayed there for observation overnight. And it was they had a neurologist come in and try to see what was going on. They think it was stress related, but it was to the point where the stress involved with my trying to do everything well and stay in good standing with the church and achieve whatever in high school, which is really what I wanted to do more than anything. I really wanted to be at the top of the class with the other kids that I knew really well. And I had all these other distractions and all this pull to spend so much time doing church activities. So I literally wound up in the hospital overnight. They could not find anything. They said it just might be psychological and stress related. But while I was in the hospital, they called the minister over. My parents wanted him to anoint me. So he came to the hospital. And his first observation was, well, it looks like she's been sinning. There's something she's done here to cause this, bring this on to her. It must be Satan at work here. And I was listening to this, and of course I wasn't feeling well. And I heard this in the background, him talking with my parents. And I'm thinking to myself, I just don't know. I don't know how to process this, right? It wasn't a way of being compassionate or wondering, what happened to me, or thinking of it in any other way than she did something wrong. She is only here because she did something wrong, right? So he left eventually, and my parents were there talking with me. And I do remember telling them at one point, because I was seriously upset. I just said, look, if all this religion, all this stuff is true, then I don't want to live anymore. Like, that's it. I don't want to be alive. If all this religion is true, if what you're telling me and what you've raised me in is true, I don't want to be around. And they got really scared because they thought I was suicidal or was going to do something to myself. But I said that and meant it. So after that, they laid off a bit and they just let me kind of make my own way with both academics. A bunch of courses came off my plate. And unfortunately, I didn't get in high school where I wanted to go, especially with math and science courses. But, music lessons went out the window after that. They wanted to trim out all the stuff that was taking up all my time and just have me more get the schedule stabilized a bit. I don't know what they attribute it to, but then there were the family issues on top of that. So just talking about the religion right now, I saw, okay, these church people will turn on you on a moment's notice. They love you one day, they appreciate you one day. And then if you have bad health or some psychological condition that's in part caused by all the pressure, they hate you and you become satanic and an object of curiosity in the church, because I took some time off of school when that happened, and it happened more than once. This didn't happen just once. So whenever I was out of church or didn't participate or the music stopped, I didn't play in church anymore, I became a point of concern for the congregation that I had done something wrong, or something was wrong with my family, or we were not in good standing with God or the church.
Of course, this ostracizing of you and your family within this moment is only going to exacerbate the physical symptoms of your psychological stress that you're already presenting. That this environment that you're now in with your religious community, that your parents saw as their extended family, that environment is not going to help you recover from, what has already partly been caused by pressures from the church.
No, and it's not truly your family. Your family typically doesn't disown you if you become ill. It doesn't disown you if you have some health conditions or stop playing an instrument. I mean, there's just something very poisonous about this whole dynamic where not only do you contribute everything, resources, everything you have to something, and then if it's not perceived as good enough or you're not doing well enough in the eyes of the local minister, you can be kicked out arbitrarily for any particular reason, whether it's makeup or hair dye, or you didn't show up at one of the church meetings. For instance, my mother was disfellowshipped at some point because she had taken care of an elderly relative that had had a car accident and gotten into an issue one night with the police, and she couldn't attend the Passover service. So she so they took attendance, it goes without saying, they took attendance at weekly church services, holy days, Feast of Tabernacles. Attendance was taken on every man, woman, and child that was mapped to the organization. And they knew my mother didn't attend. So they came to our house unexpected to confront her about why she didn't attend the Passover service. I still remember minister and his deputy came out of the car and just knocked on the door, and it was in the late afternoon one day, and I was overhearing all this from my own bedroom, and it was happening in the living room, and they were interrogating my mother as to what happened and why she didn't attend that Passover service. And she stood up for herself.
Absolutely.
And said, I had no choice. She said, there was no one else to take care of anything here if I hadn't been involved. The police were calling me because I was the only point of contact. I don't know how this could have contributed to your opinion of me as a member who was otherwise in good standing and tithing for years, participating in so many ways for years. That it all came down to this one triggering event. It's terribly scary to have people knock on your door and question you about something in that way.
Absolutely. Not just the surveillance aspect of it, like you realize that your comings and goings really are documented and you really are being watched all of the time. Even if you're, 1 week saying, oh, I wonder where Susan is. I hope she's okay. She's not at today's service. But then to take that a step further and to realize that actually you're being watched and your actions are being documented, and then you have people knock on your door asking you why you went. What is the purpose behind this? Is it because you're not there to tithe? Is that what the big issue is here with somebody that doesn't attend 1 week?
Yeah, I think it's the control and the absolute ownership of your time, resources, and attention. And it's to make examples out of people. Quite frankly, if there's no one bad in the organization, then it's harder to keep that level of control. If everybody's tolerated what they're doing and there are no outliers, you can't point to very concrete examples of good or bad, it's harder to keep people in line. But if you can read out in an announcements in your 2-hour service, they had announcements every service, and sometimes those would go on 10 or 20 minutes. They would read out if there was someone disfellowshipped. So-and-so is no longer allowed to attend. Please discontinue contact with this person. It's assumed that Satan, is now, fully in control of their future, and, their thinking is not something you should be exposed to anymore. Like, it was framed in such a way that they would just cancel people out. Canceling wasn't a thing yet back then. You didn't use the word cancel, but that's effectively what they were doing. They were throwing people in the garbage can. So they had that kind of power over people where they could just, as soon as they said someone was out, you could bank on everyone falling in line and thinking, oh, wow, that person's out now. I wonder what happened. Gee, that's awful. They probably did some really bad things. And it wasn't even clear what the people did in a lot of cases. It was pretty arbitrary.
I just can't believe that. They show up unannounced, I guess, to see, why your mum didn't attend. Did she have a good enough reason not to be there? Maybe expecting her to have spent the day, I don't know, at a family barbecue or go to the cinema or been out shopping or something else. Maybe one of those reasons, everybody should be able to spend their time how they want to, but maybe one of those reasons they'd be like, oh, well, everyone gets together on a Saturday and you've gone to the cinema. You could go to the cinema any other day of the week. But she was literally taking care of a family member who had nobody else to take care of them. But that doesn't matter, because that woman, clearly, if she has mental issues, she's Satan possessed. I just can't believe that.
Not converted. So she's, again, an outcast. She's a relative, and relatives are not prioritized. End of story. Full stop. No exceptions. And my mother clearly was prioritizing something other than funneling her full attention to the church. So that's the black and white. There's a clear cutoff. There are no excuses.
And then she's going to be
know-
publicly named and shamed in front of her congregation, but they're never going to know the full story. So there's gossip, there's speculation, but nobody will ever really know unless they do what they're not supposed to and reach out to your mum and ask her what happened. You know, this community that she's thrown herself into and given all of this money and time to for all of these years is suddenly going to turn their backs on her. But this is it's just absolutely abhorrent.
What's awful in this case, you know, I said people, sometimes weak people or people with baggage, pre-existing baggage, ended up in this church. So I have to share that my mother was adopted. Her mother abandoned her and her brother, who was of similar age, and they were adopted by a relative. Someone that has that sense of abandonment and rejection coming into another situation like this, where there's abandonment and rejection, and it's even more powerful in a way when you're an adult and it's happened. There's just so much damage here. It happened to the wrong person. You know, it was bad to happen to anyone, but it just really put extra strain on my family when that happened, because of what baggage they had prior to the church. It's just to think that one triggering event can do that. It's just the sense of fear and panic, you know, whether as a child or a member, but you know, it's almost worse if you're a member and you're giving all your money and time and energy. If you're a child, it has a different feel to it. But really awful. And then our family was called about not tithing as well. We were, you know, my mother had written a letter to the headquarters talking about the ministry, our local ministry, and how severe the sermons were, that they were, you know, kind of depressing and demoralizing. And, you know, she was keeping her tithes in a savings account, not sending them in. And then I got a phone call after school the one day where I was home. My parents weren't yet home. And it was Joe Tkach asking for my mother, wanting to talk to her. And he called back later when she was home, but the call was basically about, you are robbing God, not sending in your tithes. We know you're not sending in your tithes. So, you know, I don't want to put everything on the money button, but in my mind, so much of this organization was wrapped around the money and how the money was coming in and how it was used and how you extorted it from people in the first place. But I don't think it would have existed if there weren't so much monetary gain to be had. I don't think these people believed in their religion at all. I think it was a tool used to warp people's minds and control them for financial benefit.
It just sounds impossible. It sounds absolutely impossible. Of course, your mum made the right decision in that situation from my personal point of view. I feel like anybody put in that position would have to make the same choice. But then with all of the pre-existing trauma and experiences that your mum's had on top of this, I think you are right to keep putting your kind of eggs in the money basket.
So they had my dad, they had him hooked, and he was fearful of supporting my mother. He continued going to church. He continued with the activities. He took my sister and me to the youth activities and sports and drove hours on Sundays to take us different places. My mom felt completely abandoned, not only by the church, not only by her biological mother, but now by her own husband, choosing the church over her. So you can imagine what kind of emotional wreck she was and still is over these things, even decades later, that so much was chosen above her and her needs, and even denying her really being a human in so many ways.
This weaponizing of family members against one another as well as a form of control, the shunning, the disfellowshipping, it's probably one of the worst consequences of these high demand religious groups. And it comes from my point of view down to this impossibility again, almost like when some situations are set up for children to be punished no matter what they do. The situations in some of these high demand religious groups, some of these wilderness programs that we discussed with the troubled teen industry, some of the environments exist to the point where it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be doing something wrong, which will result in some type of punishment. And of course, that keeps control over individuals, that keeps you fearful, that keeps you in line, that keeps you coming back because you're terrified of the consequences of what happens if you miss one service from helping a family member.
Yeah, and I remember my sister was concerned after, and again, she was the one brainwashed more from birth. She said, I hope they don't think that we're bad too, meaning the rest of the family. And, she said that directly to my mom, which just cuts to the core when your own family member is brainwashed against you, basically. I can't tell you how much emotional and psychiatric damage is done by these groups. And it doesn't seem like anyone is going to change any laws around any of this, or even nonprofit status of certain types of organizations like Worldwide Church of God. It just seems like this country likes enterprise, whether it's religious enterprise or business enterprise. I think all that's fine, but with children, you have no choice. You're being manipulated and emotionally, psychologically raped from a very early age, and I think that should be criminal, personally. I don't think there's an excuse for allowing that. It's different if you're a consenting adult, but with children, it just does so much harm.
Mm-hmm. And even in some of these environments where there is this level of exploitation and coercion, it really does convert some adult mindsets to childlike mindsets, where they're so dependent on the leadership or the environment or the community that actually they can't think like adults or rationally or for themselves or independently. So even in that case, to think about adults making decisions for themselves, there is no space for that either a lot of the time in some of these groups. And I wonder if there is sort of like a commonality in some of these things that we're talking about, with the minister visiting you in hospital, the minister coming to speak to your mum about her not attending. Is this all kind of with the change of ministers, where this severe person comes in and there's a lot of shifts and changes? Do you feel like that's kind of like a poignant turning point for your experience in the church?
It was. I remember quite vividly some of the activities that I alluded to. They were after church socials, or just more lively, fun types of things that the congregation really liked. They liked, hanging out in the evening and doing a square dance, or maybe even watching some movies, or it was just a more lighthearted time. And there was a band that was a local band of the church members. Some played instruments, and I won't reveal the name of it, but it was a band that people would allow playing at these socials. And it was some pop music involved, and that was all shut down. Like, some of these fun things were viewed as deviant and too liberal when the new minister came in, and he shut down things that had been going for years. And a lot of people raised an eyebrow about that, but it was all in the spirit. So when the financial scrutiny came up in the late 70s, as I described with this church, the way Herbert Armstrong framed it as Satan was attacking the church, and it was this really, really critical time, because obviously that it was because of the members and the liberalness, and stuff was going off track. He had this newfound mission to get the church back on the track. So he was throwing it at the members, saying, look what you've done to this church. We're getting Satan after us now. Satan is chasing us down, and we've got to really clean things up here. He would be pounding on the lectern, and again, the angry face, and just yelling about how bad things were and how we should all be ashamed of these liberal influences from society. So yes, there was a crackdown in the church area that I grew up. And in the early 80s, we got a new sheriff in town that was, I know, there to set some examples with people that were either put out or, decisions were made where maybe there was a marriage related decision. Can this person divorce or not? Or like really conservative approaches to decisions about people's personal lives, of what they're allowed to do or not allowed to do.
And was this the same minister that visited you in the hospital and
Yes.
and came to your mum's house?
Those were two different ministers, but along the same ilk,
Right.
put it that way.
Right.
Like the conservativeness continued up until doctrine started changing in the early 90s, from what I understand. I was no longer involved after 1990.
Right. And what do you remember about the changes after these ministers came in? Was there sort of a different atmosphere? Were the children treated any differently, or you as sort of a young adult kind of teen at this point? Were things starting to change in a way that you were realizing, before your trip to hospital, that maybe this was not the path that you wanted to continue on for the rest of your life?
To me, day to day, it didn't feel too much different, except I knew that some of the members and their children that wore more provocative clothing, or with big slits in the skirt, or maybe they had some chest hair showing, with a man, having poor posture, putting his hands in his pockets. Like they came down hard on appearance and dress, and became more conservative, and they had the minister's wife talk to people, single them out, and
Right.
pull them aside, and telling them whether it was appropriate or not what they were doing with their dress, and very publicly in some cases would pull a teen aside and say, well, that's inappropriate what you're wearing there, that's too see-through, or you should make sure you have something that's cut differently or whatever. But I'd say day to day, it really hit me when that situation came with just too much to do and too much focus was on the church. I would say for a child, yeah, there was definitely rigor around the Bible lessons and keeping attendance. That was a big thing. Keeping attendance became much more of a priority with the new minister.
Mm-hmm.
So there were people that were designated in our congregation to carry a little notebook on the Sabbath, and they would manually have lists of people down to the child, so the parents and the child, but definitely to see if all the baptized members were in attendance or not. And if somebody was not in attendance, I remember my mother, for different reasons, was not able to go every week. She was almost there every week, but the times that she was not there, somebody would ask me specifically, is your mother here today? Where is she? They would want answers to that question of somebody's whereabouts. And it put me in a very odd position too, because clearly if I just said she's not here, I wouldn't reveal anything more than that. If she was helping a relative or didn't feel well or whatever, I thought it was very intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would check the notebooks of the youth as well in the Bible studies that we had for youth Bible studies. I remember one time, unannounced, we were all asked to give our notebooks in to the minister to look through. So note taking was mandatory. Everybody had to take notes during services or Bible studies, or you had to, I don't know what people were writing in there. I mean, I would sometimes make notes of scriptures or, I guess, essence of what someone was talking about. Gave you something to do during the boring, long-winded services. So I always kept some kind of notes, but I also doodled or wrote notes to my mother, or, maybe we were talking back and forth in the notebook. So I was just horrified when they started collecting notebooks without any notice. Okay, we're going to check all your notebooks. Well, for what end? Are you going to kick someone out if they have too few notes or too many notes or the wrong type of notes? I again go back to the surveillance and fear that I mentioned. I would say that it felt a little much more enforced. Whatever had already been there, maybe it was a little more lax. Maybe people smiled more and there was more joy in the church social activities. But with the new minister, there was a lot less joy, a lot less individuality allowed, a lot less let's say, just assuming people are doing the right thing. You need to check, you need to validate, you need to surveil, you need to descend into their lives, their hearts, to see where their hearts are. And if you unilaterally decide their heart isn't in the right place, then you should kick them out, right? Like there's a lot of power in that. I think some people were getting a high from the power. So there was the minister, then a local elder or two, and then there were deacons that would be the note takers and these busybodies who would keep attendance and track records and things like that. And then there were various volunteer roles as well. And it wasn't clear sometimes who was really funneling what information back to the minister. So it was very Soviet-like in a way, very arbitrary. The decisions coming out were kind of unilateral, and you kind of had to look over your shoulder a lot, like who your friends were, who even at church, you couldn't trust just anyone, because some of them would report back to minister's wife, and you wouldn't want that. So my parents even were pretty selective on who they chose to befriend, and they were. It was my mother in particular. She didn't trust a lot of the members because of that habit of reporting back or being like extra religious. So she picked friends that tended to trend more liberal, or they lived in neighboring towns that were larger towns and maybe were more progressive in some ways, but were still members of the church. So it was an interesting dynamic. My dad had more of a converted mindset, where he was more programmed to do only certain things and to think certain way. And of course, when my mother was disfellowship, he took the side of the church, really.
So you have this experience in the hospital where you really kind of take a step back from the multiple commitments and activities that you're involved in at that point. Then your mum has this disfellowshipping, and then your father continues to take you and your sister to various church activities, and really kind of that divide between your parents increases. At what point do things change? Do you decide that you no longer want to go, or your father says, actually, maybe this isn't right? Is there like a turning point or a crescendo?
Well, luckily, when you graduate from high school, it's kind of a fork in the road. Luckily, I got some scholarship money, some grant money to go to a liberal arts college. And I was so happy to be able to go somewhere. But it kind of resolved itself because my priorities dramatically changed. There was initially this, she's, it was within an hour's drive of my home. And there was, okay, maybe she'll go to our church, or maybe that other one that's nearby, down wherever. And then I was connected with somebody there if I wanted a ride to go to church every week. But I think after a few weeks that idea was thrown out the window entirely. And I was just finding new and interesting things to get involved with. And first and foremost, I felt like I had so much lost time and so much wasted energy for 18 years. And now I had to catch up with everyone else in their learning of normal things. So I became a bookworm. I became absolutely Miss Academics to a fault. I had such a thirst for learning everything and making new friends that came from different parts of the world. And I met some really great people in my freshman year, and I didn't look back ever since then. Made the most out of whatever came through. But those were very difficult years, those final years of high school, because not only was my dad taking us to church activities, my mother decided not to go to the Feast of Tabernacles, at least for my junior and senior year. And she got involved with her boss at the time, and that's a whole separate story. But our family was pretty much torn in half, with my dad taking us to the feast, and she would be off doing whatever it was that she was doing and surviving in the way that she thought she needed to survive. But it's very difficult to see all this happening and remain focused in any way on your academics and not feel like you're causing some of the problems. I can still hear the heated arguments and the anger coming from the basement, where my parents were yelling at each other about some of this stuff, mostly my mom yelling at my dad. But I don't think they realized you could hear everything upstairs. All these all these church related arguments and, blaming one or the other for X, Y, or Z. And like the kids absorb this stuff. It's not as if they feel like they're faultless in it, or if they're taking a side. I think we felt very differently about the situation. I sided with my mother, thinking that my father was not being kind to her. My sister took more of the thing, like, I don't want to be viewed as a bad person like my mom. So it was really rough. I didn't feel like my sister and I were close anymore after that happened. And she later became a Jehovah's Witness. So she was deeply converted into thinking in terms of religion being a really big fixture in her life and needing that long term. And she married someone who was also in the Jehovah's Witness faith. So she was quite brainwashed, I would call it, from an early age. And it really made the family quite splintered. So I was happy to leave this when I left, and I went off to college and I didn't look back.
I imagine from your mum's perspective as well, there's some of the times where there's been guests on the show and they've talked about how, divorce within the religious group in discussion is seen as such a big no-no in their church, that the man will go off and have affairs with other women, and then the woman will stay home and take care of the kids, and then the husband will return and she's just kind of expected to forgive him and carry on because he can be absolved of his infidelity, but they can't divorce because it's such a sinful act. In this situation where your father's kind of siding with the church and taking you and your sister to these church activities and having this really contentious relationship with your mother at this point, she just sounds like she decided that if she couldn't be part of that community anymore, if they'd literally kicked her out and your dad was siding with that community that literally kicked her out, it's not like she decided to go. Then she's like, well, I'm going to have some kind of life. I'm going to do some things for myself. Otherwise, she just sits in the house and just fades away.
Well, that was actually a pretty clever way of dealing with it, because divorce, you're right, was very much frowned upon. And if my father had suggested a divorce or wanted to go that route, I know that wouldn't have been something he would have wanted to deal with, the wrath of the church over that, or to expose their personal situation. Right. He wouldn't have, he wanted to sweep it under the rug if they were having marital issues. And I know that he at the time confided in one of the children that I grew up with, and I compared notes later, but apparently my father had a really hard time with all this too. As you can imagine, it's highly dysfunctional, and for the children involved, is highly dysfunctional to have to take a side or to overhear these reasons for rejecting people or members, or just trying to navigate this, or thinking that, why is this a part of my life at all? When you start becoming of an age where you have more of your own thinking, and you have your own aspirations of what subjects you like to study in school, that type of thing. It just, for me, it became very difficult. I wanted out of this dysfunctional house. Yeah. And I know my sister dealt with it in different ways, but she drifted away in other ways, like just mentally wasn't there, was drowning herself in there were some video games at the time. So she was doing a lot of video games and Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, and trying to get absorbed in different ways into different things. So I think we all deal with these stresses differently, but I can tell you it was just a very frightening time, and certainly not a good home environment to have to figure out who's right here, what's happening, and how do I fit in, and how does anyone support me in this mess? Children get lost. They sort of get lost in the shuffle. And that's a good time to bring up the fact that there were suicides in my church area. And just like there was a girl who was in her teens. I was not close to her. She lived pretty far away, and my parents didn't know her family very well, but she put a gun to her head. I think she was about 15 or 16 in her own house, and shot herself. And this was a girl who the strict minister reacted, "See, this is an example. Clearly Satan," her name was, let's say, Sandy. Sandy was captured by the devil. That Sandy fell for the influences of the devil with the music she listened to and the people that she hung out at school.
Gosh.
Look what happened to Sandy. There was not an iota of compassion. There was not a word of remorse or thinking, how could the church have supported people better? Or it was a, see what happens when you go to Satan. See what happens when you're not reaching for the church or reaching for God or Herbert Armstrong or, your Bible lessons or whatever. They needed examples. These examples would just electrify everybody. Like, oh my God, that's evil manifest. Here's a great example of evil happening.
That is so awful for the parents, though. It's almost like a public shaming for them when they've just lost their child. Like, they have to stand in this congregation and listen to this minister basically blame them for allowing the worldly influences to take hold of their child.
There were also exorcisms. There was one that I was aware of in my congregation where it was a teenage boy who I think had behavioral issues. Like, it was, I don't know what would have been diagnosed in the 1980s. It was a different world than it is today with diagnoses of, conditions or special needs or this type of thing. But he was in church one week and then never reappeared. And the message that came through was that individual, there was an attempt to do an exorcism, that Satan had clearly gotten hold of this boy and they were working through it, but you were not supposed to have any more contact with that person. And that became more of the norm. Once in a while you would hear these types of things coming through. But I think they needed these types of stories to keep people in line and to keep them fearful of what could happen.
Especially after reading your 20+ page summary on your experiences in the Worldwide Church of God that you allowed me to read. The specifics on punishments within the church, the punishments for children, for adults. I mean, we've spoken about some of it in terms of the spankings and the spiritual abuse. We've talked about the disfellowshipping and the shunning and the public shaming. But then mental health is not even, or ill mental health is not even being recognized within the church either. So people that have certain behaviors that they can't control or certain emotions that they can't regulate are going to be subjected to this punishment because this is not recognized in the church. Again, it's impossible.
It's a black and white thing. It's either behavior that God would approve of, the church would approve of, they're really one and the same, or it falls outside of the norm. And if it falls outside of the norm, there's Satan at work there. So it's very simple. It's very, very simple to discern. Either it fits the mold or it's outside of the mold and it has to be removed.
Some of the things that I read in your writing reminded me of an interview that I did recently with Heather Heath about her experiences in Bill Gothard's Advanced Training Institute, about how there's a ton of acronyms for different things, but every negative thing would be reworded in a positive way. So if they were doing blanket training on children, they wouldn't call it like, beating the children or punishing the children. It was called blanket training. And they had like nice names for things like camps where people that have been caught sexually abusing, family members or people in the church, they'd be sent to, these different programs that had names that sounded really formal. I didn't know if there were any examples you could remember from your writing in that were similar in the Worldwide Church of God in terms of, kind of labeling certain things that the church did.
I think they were pretty upfront about the role of punishment and, correcting children. And like they use the word correcting a lot. That it clearly anything that deviated from utter obedience to what was being taught, or the parents themselves, had to be nipped in the bud. It just couldn't be allowed to exist, and it couldn't be allowed to influence the others in the church. So if you saw behavior, even if it wasn't your own child, you were supposed to go over and yank them and spank them, or do whatever you needed to do to rein it in. I think there was a pretty common understanding that was needed, and that it was everyone's responsibility to look for outliers to yank into line, whether or not it was your own child. I think there was some disagreement with the parents on what the proper role there was. And I know some of them would even take their children out to the car or away from view to do whatever they wanted to do during the church service if they weren't behaving correctly, or take them to the women's room and have a really serious conversation and a beating in there. But it was pretty plain as day what was going on. I don't think it was sugarcoated. I do think I mentioned positive reinforcement on a lot of these activities where, when absent any normal activities in the real world that are fun and colorful and, allow you to express your individuality, yeah, they're fun. These activities are fun if that's all you have. If the only notion of a social engagement is in the form of a church-related event, even if it's dressed very conservatively and put on as an event that may not be so fun. I mean, it does reinforce, especially the Feast of Tabernacles, where they had convention centers, large stadiums full of church members that would get together and celebrate the holy days and the festival for 8+ days together. You saw that there were a lot of other people that were doing the same thing that you and your family were doing. And it reinforced that's actually something big. It's bigger than the local congregation. It's thousands of members. It's, producing all these television programs, and there's a whole campus, and there's, these singers that stand outside the auditorium and have all these pastel colored clothing, singing like Lawrence Welk. If you're familiar with Lawrence Welk in the United States, it was a show that had a lot of very conservative singing and dressed people. You should look it up. Quite funny. But yeah, all this was positive reinforcement of what things should look like, right? And if you weren't behaving that way, it was something that had to be moved into line. So it looked like the advertisement, basically.
And you talked us through how you distanced yourself from the church. There were plans once you got into liberal arts school, there were plans for you to maybe attend different congregations, but still maintain your commitments to the church.
Because I never got baptized. Baptized members were held to a different standard than a child growing up in the church. You have to remember that. Any non-baptized person that was attending was not fully protected and would not have God's, bestowed advantages unless they got fully converted and baptized. They usually didn't want you baptized until you were at least 16 or 17, or better yet, 18, where you knew what you were getting into. And I do have to hand it to them. That is a better age to do it than, say, in your early teens or when some of the other churches do, because it is so serious. If you're committing to this kind of thing, it's something I would never have committed to. At that age, I was not ready to commit to something like that. I had too much to see and explore that I didn't understand. I was just so hungry for correct information. When I realized I had been lied to for so many years, that so much had been concealed or misportrayed, or it was inaccessible to me. And now there's this whole treasure trove of information that opened up. That's how I responded to it. Like, put all that on hold. I have to find out what the real situation is here that's been hidden for so long. So it was great. I didn't look back, but it does, the effects crop up later in life. You're not off the hook. This stuff leaves a mark. I would just say that I think I'm in the luckier side of the camp that had some other influences that influenced me other than my parents, too, that I mentioned. And not everybody had that. But then there's still things that come up. Like I really don't trust people very easily at all, anyone, because I see the abuse, so much abuse of power, so much abuse of people's time and resources, and just the lying for selfish reasons, just deceiving people that are innocent, that are manipulable, or whatever the word is, that they're in a bad state of mind, and they need a strong leader of some sort, and you're just abusing people. I don't think I can ever trust people in any, whether that's in relationships or with work relationships, or there's something that's permanently broken when you've seen this type of thing happen at such a personal level so young. I can tell you that haunts you for the rest of your life.
That was actually going to be my next question. Sort of, you realized that there was other things in life you wanted to pursue outside of the church, and even though you didn't look back, what has your life been like since, and has the church still played a role in your decision making, in your personality, in how you think and feel and react to things?
Well, I think it's unavoidable. Something this such a profound duration and intensity has to shape to some extent how you view the world and how you think. The lack of trust or inability to trust people, especially authority figures, that runs deep. So I've been in the corporate world for most of my adult life. So after getting my liberal arts degree, I didn't continue with any further degrees, mostly due to financial reasons. And I can say not that I have trouble with authority at work. I think I can work through any situation, but my immediate reactions to things around authority are questioning authority, speaking my mind. And then unfortunately, the ethics, I think I have very strong ethics at this point. I think there's good and bad, but maybe it wasn't what I was taught in church. It was what I learned through the church experience, that there are good and bad intentions, and that those need to be called out. If wrong is being done, or something deliberate is done to hurt other people, that has to be called out. And in the corporate world, that's not always a useful type of thing to be doing, calling out where you might see ethical compromises, or you might be ashamed of what your organization is doing. So I would say, in the personal relationship side, it definitely has influenced my decision to remain. I've tried marriages, but they haven't really fit well for me, because I always felt like somebody wanted to dominate me in the marriage, or maybe it hadn't even been positioned that way up front, but in practice, it seemed like I was supposed to fall in line and be agreeable to what the man in the relationship wanted, and I rebelled against it. So I've found that I prefer living alone, and I don't know if that would have happened if the church hadn't been a part of my early years. It's hard to say. Not to pin, I'm much happier now than I've ever been in earlier years. So I can't say it's a negative thing, but it's a realization.
And it's interesting that you've connected with your music teacher now that you're in a position that maybe she was similar to when you were influenced by her in those younger years. So it's like full circle. And I bet she just loves hearing from you and knowing that you're kind of, taking some of her strength and power and applying it to yourself in this current day.
Well, she did wonder what happened when, after I stopped taking lessons, and she said it, admittedly, I would have loved to have pulled you aside at some point and asked you what was wrong, because she reminded me that I would be in tears. Some of my lessons, I would be in tears, and for no good reason. And she knew there was something wrong. Something she was saying was triggering me in some way that had nothing to do with violin lessons, right? So instinctively, she knew what my parents were doing with me was probably not so healthy. And she really couldn't get at that ever. So she was happy to hear I've distanced myself and no longer involved in anything similar, and that charting my own course. So yes, I think she probably had more influence than she realizes.
And what was your family's reaction to you moving away from the church? at the time that you made that decision, and subsequently throughout the years, your relationship with your family and friends that you made in church?
So at this college I went to, I got involved with a lot of foreign students, and my first boyfriend, I think, shocked them. So my freshman year, I got a boyfriend at some point who was about 10 years older, and brought him home at some point, and he was from the former Soviet Union, and just was very, very different for them to see. And my mother, in her awkwardness, said, "What do you see in our daughter?" You know, because he was in medical school. This is hilarious. So he said, "Well, it's not what she is now. It's what I think she'll become one day," which was even worse. You know, like the two of them saying that. But no, they saw that I was going in a very different direction from how they raised me, but not necessarily in a negative. They didn't have a negative view of it. They just thought, okay, well, she's found her own course, and there's not much we can do at this point, but let her go. You know, I think they were of a generation where, and a culture where, you know, once you turn 18, you're kind of expected to be pretty independent. Yeah. It wasn't, I'm from a family where you're living at home in your 30s, even if you have a financial setback or something like that. It's of a, you know, more Nordic culture where you kind of, you push the kid out of the nest at 18 and they're gone, and they need to start their own lives and have their own family and chart their own course. So in that respect, it's very healthy in this context, right? It's not healthy in all contexts, but in this particular context, I think they've taken things in stride, and I do think they appreciate what I've accomplished and how I've really made my own way. And it doesn't seem like I'm unhappy. You know, if I were unhappy or appearing unhappy, I think they would question it, but it doesn't. Yeah, doesn't seem that to them.
What's your relationship like now with your mother and your father, and how are they with one another?
So they're now in their 80s. They're up in their years. They're still living independently. I made a rule with them. I said, I don't care how many religions you cycle through. I will love you as parents, regardless of what you are. Any given week I talk to you, but we will not talk about religion, and we will not talk about politics. And those are the ground rules. We can talk about the climate. We can talk about the weather. We can talk about your health. We can talk about, you know, your neighborhood pals. I don't care. But all those meaningful topics where you would hope there's some connection there and there isn't, those are off limits. I will not be, no attempts at conversion, yep. No arguing about religion or its effects. So we have a pretty superficial, but I'd say, you know, all said and done, cordial, effective relationship at this point. I care about them as human beings and my parents. Do I like them as people? Unfortunately, I would never pick them out as people I'd hang out with, but they're my parents, you know. Yeah. So my sister unfortunately died in her 30s. She had a terminal illness and then took her own life. So she jumped off a bridge, which was very traumatic, as you can imagine. That is one of the reasons I'm still in touch as much as I am with my parents, because parents never recover from that. So there's that as well. But yeah, there was a terminal illness, and then she didn't want to persist with as a Jehovah's Witness. There's medical treatments you don't want to sign up to. There really wasn't much that could have been done in her situation anyway, even if she had not been a Jehovah's Witness. So she said no to some of the latter stages of interventions that would have caused seizures and other things she didn't want to experience. So she basically at some point, and I didn't know it was happening at the time, said goodbye to me. And she had been newly married. She wanted children. It was just very, very sad. And it's one of the reasons I do think my poor parents, you know, they need my support. We don't need to agree on religion. We don't have to talk about certain things, but I want them to know that I'm still there in some capacity.
I'm really sorry to hear that happened with your sister. You've spoken about, you know, you idolized her when you were younger, and things got difficult between the two of you with your conflicting sort of belief systems at one point in your life. So it sounds as if you really had to grieve her more than once, which can never be easy when a sibling is a best friend when you're growing up, and then they're no longer there. I mean, there's disfellowshipping and shunning where there's no contact, but at least the person is still there, and there is a chance to reconnect. So for her to make that decision around her own ending of life, it must have been so many conflicting things going on with her at that time.
It was, and suicide was really frowned upon by the religion. What wasn't, and I know Jehovah's Witnesses frowned upon it too, even more harshly, because they really ran the whole funeral for her and were making it clear that God forgives everything, even suicides, and saying all kinds of things that I wish they hadn't been saying in the funeral. It was just a very unfortunate. She was much more converted at some level than I ever could have been, and I never held it against her. But it's just like the same with my parents. It puts a wedge there at some fundamental level. You can't talk or agree on certain things. They just don't exist for me. What they need and what they think exists. If it makes them happy or more settled in life, that's fine with me. It doesn't make me more settled. It doesn't make me appreciate life more, believing certain things. So we made our peace with that.
Somebody once said to me, you love your family, but you don't have to like them. Sometimes, I might feel like that about some of my family members. I'm sure everybody listening can relate to that. And that's kind of what I feel like you were just saying there before. Like, I love my family, but I've set firm boundaries with them. And it's good as an adult that you can take those proactive steps to protect yourself and say, like, if I want to maintain contact, but this is what I'm asking for in return. And if you can't stay within the boundaries that I am setting as an adult who understands my limitations and my own mental health, then unfortunately there will be no contact. So I think it's really good when people realize that they have the power and the option to do that for themselves, where they're raised in environments where actually they're not told that they have this power and the ability to make these decisions and ways to protect themselves. So I feel like what you said there, about certain topics being off the table and firmly we are not going to be discussing them, might be some great pieces of advice for some people that are listening today that may be struggling with their own family or loved ones around difficult conversation themes or going over past trauma that some people in the family might want to talk about and others in the family might not want to, with all the kind of rabbit hole conspiracy theorist problems rising in some households in some parts of America, where family members are like, my family member is such an avid Trump supporter, and they're saying that, all of these things about the vaccine, and they've got this suddenly like change of personality and wild belief systems that I just don't agree with. And we're just arguing and fighting to the point where we're not going to be talking anymore. That might be a great time to kind of put those boundaries. And you can't do it with everybody, because some people are just going to not respect those boundaries whatsoever. But it's an option for you to be firm. And you've just said there that you're still in contact with your parents, so those boundaries have worked for you. I feel like that's a great thing that people might be able to take away from this episode. And that kind of leads me really nicely into asking if there are any other notable things from your experience that you wanted to discuss, and what advice you would offer to others who have experienced high demand religious groups and really been affected throughout their childhoods and into adulthood.
Yeah, well, first of all, we're lucky we're in an information age, an age rich of easily accessible information. There's no guesswork. Like when I grew up, there was limited information I had on what the rest of the world was doing, or outside of an encyclopedia or maybe a random trip to the library at times, I could get some books and learn more about other religions or whatever. But nowadays, I would say go with your instincts. If something is gnawing at you, not feeling correct, if you're being instructed in ways that make you very uncomfortable, that give you a lot of doubts and questions, don't silence them, because you're probably in a situation where you're just finding the teachings not consistent with how you can live long term. So don't think that you're a bad person, or maybe everyone else around you is behaving a certain way and you seem like an outlier, or you think you're being I don't know, you're not a bad person, I guess. Having those doubts and questions, first of all, you're not a bad person. You need to look into what you're doing and be full-heartedly in back of it if you're going to commit to something high demand. So if it's not fitting you, just like a garment or any other, thing you're wearing, you need to find something that does fit, right? So I think that nowadays, with the internet, with other ways to get help, I think people are in a better spot than when I grew up. There are very limited ways to get help, but find somebody who's non-judgmental. Doesn't matter who, but who do you know in your neighborhood, in your school? It doesn't matter what age the person is, someone you can talk to about the conflict you might be having with the religion or the family upbringing or whatever it is. And make sure you have at least one person you can talk openly with that will not judge you, that will just allow you to talk, because that will at least open up the thinking, and you will be able to feel like you're at least allowed to explore something else other than what you're suffering in or you're not feeling comfortable in. But make sure it's a non-judgmental person who doesn't have a horse in the game, who isn't going to try to lead you back to the path or it has some agenda for you. Make sure it's someone who just wants to open you up to yourself. That's what's really important, because it could be that maybe you just need to vent on some things, but you truly do believe in this religion, or the beliefs do have a grip on you it's not going to let up. You need someone to talk through the challenges with that may not be available in the organization. I've seen that work with some families where they're still in it to this day or something similar, and they seem fairly happy because they're a strong family in and by themselves. But do they do everything letter of the law? No. There's a lot of hypocrisy, but the religion is some binding force, and if it works on some level, it works. It's not that I'm anti-religion. I just think if something is not working for you, you need to explore why it isn't working and find the right people to help you navigate it. Even if you're at an age where you can't live independently yet, your mind is thinking independently, and you have to let it go in the right direction, grow towards the light, wherever that light is coming from.
I love that. I love that. Finding somebody non-judgmental, and it might be a lot easier for some people than others. It might be almost impossible for some people, especially if their communities are made up of members of the religious group that they're involved in, or the cult-like group that they're involved in. So that might not be as easy to do for some, but somebody that doesn't have a horse in the race, I love that expression. I feel like I'm going to steal that and use that later on, because it's as you and as you said, it's so hard to trust people, especially people, authority figures, because you're always questioning agendas and you're always questioning motives, and you're always questioning whether there's manipulation taking place, and then probably looking out for things like, gaslighting and other forms of psychological abuse that people might be applying, because that's what you experienced from your authority figures growing up. So somebody that doesn't have a horse in the race, that's such an awesome expression. It might be difficult for you to find, as you also said, people in your church to trust, because of the self-policing systems that are in place, the high surveillance of congregants that takes place, of the public shaming where people will publicly talk about who has been disfellowshipped. And so it might be difficult to find somebody in the church environment that you can trust to have these non-judgmental discussions with. So somebody outside of that community, if it's possible.
If you're in a public school, I know I had one teacher, he was a German teacher, so German language instruction, and he saw that I had a real gift for languages, learning languages very quickly. And and he pulled me aside a number of times and he said, you say you don't have any plans to go to college, or you might go to this church college, but I think he said, you really need to get to college somehow. And he was giving me some ideas of where to apply, or, he was just telling me, okay, I've taught hundreds of children and you are so much more advanced in this area. He was really helping me understand you don't throw gifts away. If you have gifts, and all it takes is that one teacher in a public school, or a neighbor who might even see that you're a really good athlete or something like that, or someone who doesn't have the horse in the game, that is just the passive observer thinking, what a wonderful human being this is. And I need to encourage that person to fully embrace what they're doing well, and what they can be. So it could be anyone. I can point to a few different figures in my life who made a big difference, also even in corporate America, who just took an interest in, working against the system that was otherwise there, and insisting that I get promoted, or insisting on something happening.
So great that you're able to recognize those people as well.
So I would say there's always hope, and especially in the internet age, where there are all kinds of blogs and groups, and Cult Vault is out there now. That wasn't out there when I was young, but there are a lot of survivor groups. I would say that's another place to go, even if it's not the group that you're a part of, but just to see that there are other support groups out there for high demand religious survivors. And there's so many things if you're looking at all, but otherwise, high school counselor, or college counselor, depending on what age you're at, there's usually some impartial source there too in institutions for any problems psychologically, or just not fitting in, that kind of thing. So
I love
there's
that.
Always hope.
Everything that you said there, Barbara, I love it and I support it. And I'm wondering if there's anything else that you thought we should mention before we finish up today.
I can't think of anything immediately. Just I think it's this whole part about the fear and the surveillance. The part we didn't talk about is this human need to feel special or part of something. And I think when people have that need for sense of belonging, and that they know they're going to lose it if they would leave the organization, that they're going to have to find something else that you're going to belong to. I think that's the reason a lot of people struggle leaving. But that's beat into you very young, that you're special. You're one of the very few people on earth that belong to this one religion that's true. And if you leave it, you're going to have all kinds of consequences. But the power in that, feeling special, or even looking around the school, if you're young and thinking, wow, my parents, compared to my friends here, we're in really good shape. We're going to be saved, and we're going to be spared a lot of the tribulation and all this suffering that humans are going to go through, that we're going to be spared by. That doesn't go away overnight. That sense of belonging to something special that you're raised to think that you're in. That's the part that's hard to leave. And it's really hard to accept that you've been lied to once you feel in your heart that it's not correct, what you've been told all your life. Okay, I'm not special. Oh my God, where does that leave me now? Like, I'm not special. What do I belong to? What am I? So it can feel very, very like the hermit crab without a shell, that you're just completely vulnerable. You don't know what you are anymore. You're wandering between things. And if you are looking for something new, by all means, don't find another cult. Don't find someone who wants to tell you the same types of things, just in a different flavor. That would be the wrong direction to go, if you can discern that.
I think, yeah, absolutely. In terms of cult hopping is something that naturally comes up quite often on the podcast, but the the kind of holier than thou attitude that a lot of people have talked about really having to get over once moving away from their religious group. I feel like it's deconstructing why you're not special in the sense that the church has told you are, and why you're special in other ways. Because you with your musical abilities and your kind of proclivity for playing the violin, you with kind of pursuing your liberal arts and absorbing information after you decided that you were just going to read and educate yourself in so many other things. It's about finding what is special about you as an individual that separates you from your specialness in the church sense, I think. And everybody has something that makes them special in their individuality. And I want everybody to just get in touch and tell me what it is that makes them special as an independent individual, as opposed to why they're special if they're involved with a certain high demand religious group. Because everybody has something. And I think that's part of what makes human beings so interesting and amazing, is that everybody is different. Every single person is different. Even if people are grouped by their ethnicity or their religious beliefs or their sexual orientation, even if people are boxed and categorized in so many different ways, every single person inside those categories still completely different from each other. It's incredible. So I want everybody to get in touch and tell me what makes them special in their own way.
And that's what's taken out of you. And that's what religion tries to, in this case, the cult tried to beat out of every little child. Any kind of sense of being an individual or needing attention in some way, or, any kind of individual needs were stamped out very early. And that's the approach. So you have to regain what's been torn out of your life. And that's not easy when you're an adult and you've never allowed yourself to do what you just described. Yep. That's not easy. You need help doing that. Need reinforcement doing that.
So find somebody that's non-judgmental if you can, to talk with, to help you process things, to maybe help you formulate ideas that are just niggling away at the back of your mind, or to help you recognize what options you have when it comes to making decisions. Find somebody that is impartial, that has no kind of horse in the game. Find somebody that will just listen and allow you to have that space that you might not otherwise have in your high demand environment. And then read, research, use the internet, get hold of books, do as much research and reading as you can, so you can really not just educate yourself, but really make your own informed opinion or decision on what your own belief systems are, or places where you could go and have discussions with other people who have these same questions, so that you can engage in that with other people who are going through that same thing. Maybe deconstruction, or maybe conversion to another religion. Whatever that looks like, there is a space on the internet that exists that can accommodate any of the things that you're looking for. And then get in touch with me and tell me what it is that makes you an individual, what makes you special. What's your party trick? Everybody always says, what's your party trick? I want everybody to get in touch and tell me, so that we could just celebrate all these little things that make us different from one another, all these individual traits that make us special and separate us from one another. And I think, Barbara, that brings us to the end of our episode. I did want to say a massive thank you as well for your support of the show. You did donate to the Cult Vault a while back as well, and that's made a huge difference to what I'm able to do with the show and continuing to bring that content weekly to the public forum for free for people to listen to and access and educate themselves as well. And I get educated in these episodes that I do every time I sit down with a guest and speak to them. I think that it is inspiring what you have told us about your journey to becoming an independent person that is just living and educating and really feeling at peace and comfortable with yourself. I think that's really empowering to hear, that people can exist in those states and actually really enjoy themselves, especially after how much people are told they can be nothing without their community or religious group, how people will never amount to anything without God, and all of these horrible messages that are instilled in individuals as children. And yet you sit here as somebody that actually likes yourself, somebody that enjoys their own company, and somebody that can, live on their own and actually be the happiest now than you've ever been. I think that's really inspiring and empowering, Barbara. So thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today, giving us some more insight into the Worldwide Church of God.
Thank you so much, Casey. I hope you have listeners that can benefit from any of this, and there is always hope, no matter what stage you're at in the process. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.